Hi, I'm Mark Madison, the historian at the National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia, and we're here with another broadcast in our series we call Conservationists in Action. Rarely have we had a visitor who so lives up to that title. Jeff Ryan, author and photographer who's going to join us here, has been very much in action, hiking thousands of miles and writing very evocatively about it. Before we talk a little about Jeff's books, let me give you a little background on him. Jeff is based in Maine. He's a photographer, a speaker, and a very well traveled author. He has a contagious passion for exploring the outdoors, particularly on foot and hiking boots. He's hiked literally thousands of miles, including his first trip of a lifetime, a 6-month hike on the Pacific Crest Trail. In 1985, Jeff began a section hiking the Appalachian Trail with his childhood friend, a journey that actually took 28 years, and we'll talk a little about that in just a minute. It culminated in his first book, Appalachian Odyssey, a 28-year hike on America's trail. As he was writing this book, he became intrigued by the question of how the legendary trail came into being, and that led to his second book, Blazing Ahead, Benton MacKaye, Myron Avery, and the rivalry that built the Appalachian Trail. In 2018, Ryan published his account of climbing Mount St. Helens in both 1987 and then 2017, and his most recent book is entitled Blast, My Return to Mount St. Helens. Ryan spends most of his time researching, writing, speaking, signing books, and exploring the backroads of the U.S. and Canada in his vintage 1985 VW camper. We're lucky to get him here for this week. We very much appreciate you taking a little time out of your research out here, Jeff, to talk about your book. So thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me, Mark.
I'd like to talk first about Appalachian Odyssey, a book I very much enjoyed. I read it last week, and the obvious question is, why did it take you 28 years to hike this? I hear people do it in a season.
Yeah, as little as 47 days, I think, the ultra marathoners, but we started by accident. I met a guy, I went on one hike with him, and he called me up afterwards and said what a great time we had, and I agreed, and he said, let's go over and start doing the long trail, which is the length of Vermont. It goes from the Massachusetts-Vermont border all the way to Canada. It's about 280 miles. And so he'd come up from Hartford, Connecticut, and I'd come over from Maine, and we'd meet and do sections of that. And one night, about 4 years into this, in the tent, he said, you do realize we've started the Appalachian Trail. And my reaction was I burst out laughing and said, you have to be kidding. It'll take us 30 years. And his famous 2-word reply was, so what? And
you beat that record.
We did it. We beat the record. So every year we, as he called it, we smorgasborded the trail. Which piece do you want to do next year? Let's do part of Pennsylvania. Let's do part of New York. And a lot of times, let's do part of Virginia, because it's a quarter of the trail. So that's how it all played out.
That raises a logistical question. How did you keep track of all the sections you did? Did
well,
you have a big map you highlighted or something?
Yeah, I did. I did pretty much. And Wayne, my friend Wayne Sear, is very analytical, and he was on top of every step of the way, so where we got on and where we got off. So every year we'd try to figure out how much time we had and what made sense in terms of going where, and then we just kept on going.
Did you have a favorite part of the trail?
Boy,
like your
that's
favorite child?
Yeah, it's sort of one of those. I do have to give props for southwestern Virginia. The reason for that is it's not within a big metropolitan area's reach, so you don't get the pressure that other parts of the trail get, particularly way down in the southern end where a lot of people have illusions of doing the trail and get on it and find out it's a little bit harder than a walk in the woods, and they get off. So it's a beautiful part of the trail.
What's the hardest part of the trail for you?
The hardest part, well, there are two of them. New England's pretty rugged because it's up and down, and back in the days when most of that trail was constructed, it was, hey, look, there's the top of a mountain. Let's go the shortest way to the top, which was usually an old rock slide or a riverbed. But actually, for us, the Smokies were the toughest. We waited till almost the end. So we were into our 50s, and we were still schlepping a 50-pound pack, and the ultralight movement didn't get to us in time.
That's because you were in your 50s.
That's
You're
right.
resistant to that.
Right.
Another part of your subtitle is America's Trail, and you've hiked other places, Pacific Crest Trail and so on. Why is the AT America's Trail?
Well, it's America's Trail because it was really the first super hiking trail. It was the first multi-state trail, and it's also within reach of, as I mentioned before, of a lot of people, and the familiarity is there. Geographically, it's close to a lot of people, and psychologically, I think a lot of people grew up with the AT in their midst. So they know of it, and they've been there, and it's very famous, not just in the U.S. When you're out hiking, you can meet people from all over the world on the AT.
Cool. We also listed you as a photographer, and this book is proof of it. It's profusely illustrated. And as a photographer, what type of shots were you looking for? I mean, you got 2,000 miles to choose from.
Right.
You could, take a picture of a million trees or wildlife. How did you pick what you shot?
Well, it's funny. When I was doing the Pacific Crest Trail, it was back in the age before digital. And so it taught me to be very picky with the shots that I took because I had a finite amount of film. And I think that was a really great lesson for me because it really taught me to see with a photographer's eyes. I can't just go out and blast, or couldn't go out and blast a ton of shots and hope that one of them was a keeper. I really had to try to make sure every shot was a keeper. And that was really valuable to me going forward. So when digital came on, I really had a bit of a photographer's eye because of that. And that's what helped me. And I tried to choose, certainly there are a lot of opportunities for panoramic shots, and it could be an entire book of panoramics. Yeah. But I also tried to make them fit with the narrative of the trail, which was there are man-made parts of the trail that are very much influenced by man, both when the trail was first built and then after the fact. So I tried to weave some of that in there and not pretend that those influences aren't there.
What were some of the more striking man-made influences you came across?
Well, Skyline Drive is one of them. We'll talk about that probably when we talk about Blazing Ahead, but the trail actually crosses Skyline Drive 24 times in 108 miles. So it's very much there. In other places, there were old fire towers that are still remnants of when the squads used to have to go out into the field and look for fires from there. And also one of the stories I tell in the book is about how a 1908 iron bridge was actually taken out of service, a road bridge in Pennsylvania, and repurposed to be a walking bridge on the Appalachian, which I think is really cool. It's a neat way to make sure that some of those old resources are repurposed and kept in perpetuity. Kind
of similar to rail trails and
yes,
so on, where
exactly.
you have the cultural and natural next to each other.
Exactly.
There's a lot of books on the AT. How does your book differ?
I think it differs because it's a story of a friendship over a prolonged period. I think Wayne and I started out basically hardly knowing each other and then becoming like brothers over the years. And as I say, it's sort of like a Venn diagram. You have two people with very different personalities that overlapped a bit over the years. And that is an interesting aspect. And then how the food changed, the technology changed, all of that. The path stayed the same, everything else changed.
What were the most important technological changes?
Well, we talked about film. I went all the way from slide film to
Sure.
digital in the midst of creating the book, and you can actually see it in some of the old photos. But the food and the gear changed dramatically. We went from basically aluminum frame packs to carbon fiber packs. We went from, in food, we went from Lipton one-pot meals from aisle 6. There was basically nothing else. And, now you can make breakfast burritos. Who knew? Yeah. So we can have a lot more ethnic type meals than we had at the beginning. So you can walk down any health food store aisle and see vast varieties of food that we just didn't even have back in the cup of soup days.
Hiking the trail with a friend obviously leads allusions to Bill Bryson's
Yes.
book. Did you read it? Were you influenced by it?
I actually, it broke my mother's heart. She gave me the book and thought I'd be really interested in it, which I was, but I told her I couldn't read it until after I wrote mine, because I didn't
Very
want
wise.
something to infiltrate
Having read
in.
both, yours is quite different.
Thank you. But I did read it after the fact, which I found very amusing. But it is interesting to spend that much time with a person. You learn how to innately trust each other. It's like being on a rock climb and being roped to somebody. You have to be with someone whose judgment you trust and who you trust to be honest with you about how they're feeling physically and mentally, because your trip depends on it too. And that was an interesting aspect of it.
Do most hikers, this raises a question, you see on the AT, are they hiking solo or are they hiking with a partner?
A lot of people hike with a partner, but most people are finding out now that even if you start out solo, you don't stay that way for long. Particularly if you get on with the great group that kind of heads out of Georgia in March and April. You make friends while you're going, and everyone kind of keeps tabs on each other as you go. This was a little different because we were often out in the fall when there were hardly any people out and it was just us. And you literally had the pick of the litter in terms of campsites and lean-tos, and there weren't any bugs. The mosquitoes were gone, and we used to say no bugs and no tourists, just us. So that was kind of a nice aspect of it.
What do you think is a better way to experience the trail? Do a through hike or sections?
Both. It's really a treat to do a 6-month hike, and I would do it again in a second. The self-reliance aspects of it, the logistical parts, the just being away from everything for that length of time is really a gift. But then again, doing a section hike is the same thing, only different. As I say in the book, it gave us an opportunity to really just delve into where we were at the particular time and treat each trip as a gift. When you're on a through hike, you tend to have this mentality of I have to keep making progress, and I think that diminishes a little bit your ability to kind of enjoy what's totally happening in front of you, because in the back of your mind is this, I need to make Canada before it snows.
Right.
So even on days off, what they call 0 days, 0 mileage days, it's hard. You keep thinking, boy, I better get up and really get some more miles tomorrow.
Where you guys could just enjoy.
Right. So
play
we
space.
knew, boy, if we do a big day tomorrow, we can have a short day the day after, and it's supposed to be going up over this mountain with great views, and we can relax and have a 2-hour lunch, or we can get somewhere early and watch the sun go down. And that part of it, I think, is really a great way of a great aspect of section hiking.
I've seen how you're researching now while you're at NCTC, but it raises a question. You're writing a book about a hiking trail. When you write a book like this, are you taking notes on the trail, or are you doing a lot of your writing immediately after you get home while it's fresh?
A little bit of both. Well, most of it was written in the tent at night, which was also an interesting aspect.
Do you have a coal miner's
yeah, I
lighter?
do, actually, the headlamp.
Yeah.
And Wayne, being a man of few words and an introvert, would scratch down a few words and say, okay, you ready to make dinner yet? And I'd be, 20 pages later. I didn't take many notes as I went during the day. I tend to have a photographic memory, so I remember when I look back through the guidebook of, oh yeah, when we got to the top, I saw a deer and, that kind of thing. And so I did a really good job of recapping at the end of the day. But the one interesting exception was we got back from a trip, and it was actually, I'd finished the book and I sent it to the publisher, and I woke up in the middle of the night 3 nights later, and thought, oh my gosh, there's something tragically wrong with the book. So I ran to my computer and I found out that I had not submitted a chapter of the writing part. I had submitted the photos and the maps. And I thought, what's wrong? And so I went to find my journal, which I found, And I opened it and I said, oh, I decided to take a break from writing on this trip. So I called Wayne in a complete panic and said, you don't happen to have any notes from this trip? And he called me back about an hour later and said, it's really funny. That's the only one I took really extensive notes. So I'll translate it from Wayne speak into something you'll remember. And it was just like that. Everything came back, and I submitted the chapter, and it came out pretty well, actually. So,
Did you have a trail name?
I did. I started as Trampus, and because I like to tramp around, and there was a character on an old TV show called The Virginian.
Oh yeah.
When his name was Trampus, and I always liked that name. But Wayne didn't like that name, so he named me Elthampius the Mule, because I carry so much on my back. So that kind of stuck.
Why do people have trail names, do you think?
I don't know where that originated, but it certainly caught on, and it's become really part and parcel of the whole AT experience. And if you don't have one within the first couple 100 miles, someone will give you one.
So you're better off picking your own.
You're better off picking your own. One of my favorites was Dances with Flies.
That would work well in Maine.
Yes, there are a number of gray beards, and there are granola, and you name it, but they're pretty funny.
Well, there's all sorts of traditions for the AT. We alluded to one, and your second book is quite a change of pace. Whereas Appalachian Odyssey is focused on the experience, and I like the title Odyssey because it is an odyssey in the Homeric tradition. But your second book is a straightforward history book, which we love here, since I'm the historian. And what led you to this change of pace?
Well, as I was writing Appalachian Odyssey, I really became more and more appreciative of the fact that somebody came up with this idea and got it built. And as is often said, trails don't just happen. And the older I get, the more I appreciate the fact that somebody had the foresight to build this great resource in the first place. So I started digging into the urban legend of Benton MacKaye and Myron Avery, the doer and the dreamer, actually the dreamer and the doer. And I started digging into it and finding out what made these guys tick, what made this idea even happen in the first place, and what made this really, truly obsessed guy grab onto the idea and push it through to reality. And what a fascinating tale. The more I dug, the more interesting it got.
There's a lot of resources to tell you how to hike the AT, but how do you research the history of the AT? Where are these records kept?
Well, actually, what's interesting is there's a very good Benton MacKaye biography written by a man named Larry Anderson. And so I read that book, and I got the idea that a lot of his archival materials came from Dartmouth. And they have not only the Benton MacKaye materials, but the whole MacKaye family. So that was a really great resource for me. And then for Myron Avery, it was just a really fortuitous, just kept digging and digging until I found the Maine State Archives had 10,000 letters that Myron Avery had written during the course of the building of the trail. And basically that resource alone led me to a lot of other things, but that's so rich and so full that I was able to draw a lot of material from that.
So when was the very first idea to have a trail along the Appalachians?
The first idea came to Benton MacKaye. It started germinating as a child. He was 12 years old. He lost his father. He was devastated by that, and he started taking walks in the woods around his house in Massachusetts and exploring. So that was really the first kind of inkling that the outdoors had a restorative quality to it, being in the outdoors. And then when in 1900, when he was a recent college graduate, or I guess he was about to be, he was a junior in college, between junior and senior year, he went for a hike in southern Vermont with a friend. And they ended up going up above tree line in what ended up becoming both the Long Trail and part of the Appalachian Trail. So that also left a really big mark with him about the environment and being in the mountains. And so then in 1921, he lost his wife. His wife committed suicide, actually. It was very tragic. And he went to recoup from that at a friend's house in northern New Jersey. And when he was there, he came up with this idea for this, at the time, 12-state super trail from Mount Mitchell to Mount Washington in New Hampshire. And as we know, it extended out from there into Mount Katahdin in Maine and to Springer Mountain in Georgia, originally Oglethorpe, which was Avery's doing. But anyway, the idea was put out in 1921, and it kind of bounced around for a few years with very little traction. And then in 1929, Avery grabbed the bull by the horns and in 9 years basically built it himself.
The two men, Mackay and Avery, had very different backgrounds. Let's start with Mackay. What was his training, and how did he tie into the early conservation movement in ways that were unknown to me?
Fascinating. So he grew up in a very wealthy family. His grandfather was on the ground floor of J.P. Morgan Chase and Wells Fargo, so there was no lack of money there. But his father was a dreamer like he was, and his father came up with a number of ideas about making vast amounts of money and then losing vaster amounts of money. And he would do things like come up with ideas for bringing Buffalo Bill Cody to Broadway and things that made scads of money, and then he would lose it. And his grandfather finally put a stop to that and said, if you want to do stuff, do it on your own dime. So he did, and he lost the family fortune again, or his part of the family fortune. And then he lost his life to a big project that he had basically given his life to. And Mackay was left as a 12-year-old in the wake of all of this. And so he knew the restorative nature of the outdoors, and he came up with this idea for the trail. And as a young man, 12-year-old, when they still had money, they were spending time in D.C. And he went to the Smithsonian and started drawing birds and reptiles. And he would sit on a camp stool in front of the displays there as a 12-year-old boy. He was a really gifted artist. And finally, they realized that this little boy is here every day. Why not just give him access to all the materials in the back room? So he started drawing all these things, and he had a real appreciation for nature. And that's where his conservation ethic immediately came to the fore. So he started putting together ideas of ecosystems and going out into the field and drawing plants and animals and entire ecosystems, reptiles, ponds, ferns, how everything interrelated. And he always had a mind that worked like that. How did things interrelate? So I think that directly led to this idea of this trail, which, as he said from the very beginning in 1921, should be a place where we should oxygenate and recreate and gain perspective. And for 1921, that was quite a thing to be saying.
It's odd he drifted into forestry instead of art.
Yes, it
Based
is.
on that background.
It is. And actually,
especially at Harvard, which
right,
is
right.
renowned for
well,
forestry.
it's funny how that happened, because forestry was mentioned to him by his father. And he said, well, what's forestry? And he said, well, it's this. So he started looking into forestry and found out that Yale had a school, so he applied to Yale, and Yale actually said to him, well, why don't you go to Harvard? He said, well, I didn't know Harvard had a
good
school.
Advice.
And he said, they do now, and he was the first student of the Harvard Forestry School, and then became an adjunct professor, and then an assistant professor, and then he went into forestry with Gifford Pinchot.
Which is an amazing connection I knew nothing about. And I went to Harvard as a graduate student. I don't recall them having anything named after Mackay.
Right, right.
the Harvard forest ought to be the Mackay forest or something to recognize him.
Right.
It's kind of shocking. Did his forestry inform his interest in the trail at all?
Oh my gosh, yes. And actually, the other interesting aside from his early years in Forest Service was one of his first projects was being assigned to what became the White Mountain National Forest. So he was a field officer out there documenting what needed to be documented to prove that this should be one of the Eastern National Forests. So he was involved in that. That was about 1908 and 1912-ish. And so that was very interesting. So again, the White Mountains through which the Appalachian Trail goes. So he was, it all informed it. But the thing that did him in with the Forest Service was he was a little bit too progressive for their ilk. And he came up with ideas that were structurally sound but had sort of aspects to them that were a little uncomfortable, for a little too progressive for where the Forest Service wanted to be. So he ended up leaving the Forest Service, which led him into the Appalachian Trail movement.
As you note, his early vision of the AT had 4 components, 2 of which are pretty familiar to us: a trail, which was a new idea at the time, and huts, which was a really good idea for those of us that have hiked sections of it. But his other 2 ideas were somewhat more avant-garde, and that involved community groups and the farm and food camps.
Right.
So you need to explain those a little more, since they didn't really come to fruition.
No, he foresaw the opportunity, and one of the things, just to frame it, was he was living and growing up in an era where there was a great flight from rural to urban.
Yes.
And there was a genuine fear that people would leave the farms for good and there would be no economy out in the rural areas. And that was one of the reasons why he proposed the trail, was to bring people from the city back out into the country. So he envisioned building these farm communities that were very sort of socialist villages, where people would get free room and board in exchange for working on the trail and helping put people up and feed them meals. And so what's ironic is that never really came to fruition, but communities still very much benefit economically from the trail. The lodging and the pizza places and and the people that shuttle people to the trail have all benefited. Communities have very much benefited from having the trail in their backyard. So he was right. And he was also right that people would be coming from the city to enjoy the trail. It was just not in the way that he envisioned. He didn't have to build the farm community infrastructure to make that happen. Henry Ford and the automobile helped make people want to come to the country and gave them the means to do it. And that's
then Ford built his own little farm village
that's
Dearborn,
right. That's
too.
right.
He had the money to do.
That's right.
Yeah, it's a fascinating thing. It'd be interesting to imagine an AT with little farm communities
Right.
all the way down
Right.
it. It was a very interesting idea. Let's move on to Avery, because as you mentioned, in a way, he's the doer to get the trail made. But before we jump to what he did with the trail, his background, total opposite.
Total opposite.
Opposite of what people probably even imagine, a pioneer with the AT. Tell us a little about his background.
Well, Myron Avery grew up as far down east in Maine as you can get, almost into Canada, and a very rural, and still very rural, and a fishing-related community. They had, at the time he grew up, they had 12 sardine factories in town.
Wow.
In town, and his father was actually manager of one of the sardine plants, but Myron was absolutely a brilliant man, even as a youngster, and he got accepted into Bowdoin College. The only problem was there was no money. And the citizens of Lubec passed a hat and raised enough money to send him to school. And so I believe that as we discover, Myron grows up with a bit of a chip on his shoulder, and I'm no psychologist, but I do believe that part of that was driven by the need to prove that the people did right by putting their money behind him. But he was an exceptionally driven man, and his first love was actually Katahdin, which was interesting for a kid growing up on the coast. He went inland and fell in love with Katahdin and started researching the history of the hikes around Katahdin, the trails around Katahdin, and that gave him his first entree into the sort of mountaineering and trail community, which ultimately led him to be tapped on the shoulder to build the AT, to lead the construction of the AT in 1929.
And what did he do for a living, which is extraordinary?
He was a full-time lawyer, maritime
lawyer, right.
for the government, which makes his accomplishments all that more impressive, because all of the stuff that I'm about to talk about, that we're about to talk about, happened in the context of having a full-time job. So,
And I couldn't see any place where being a lawyer influenced his thought on the AT. Maybe you could see some connection, but it's almost like these two parts of his life were dichotomized.
they were, except for the fact when he was fighting for something, you could see his lawyerly arguments coming out in spades. But he was incredibly driven. I really almost think he put Steve Jobs to shame. That he was absolutely driven to get this trail built. And I don't know if he knew that he was racing time in terms of his own longevity or not. That's open to debate, but he was so driven, it's hard to know whether he knew that he was going to have a short life or whether it was the other way around, but that working so hard did him in. But he walked the entire trail. He saw where all the trail signs should be. He measured the whole trail with a bicycle wheel that he took with him every time he went out. He was the first 2,000-mile hiker. He wrote the guidebooks, and he wrote all the publicity materials, feeling that, oh my gosh, we're going to build this trail and no one's ever going to even know it exists. No one's going to use it. So he was absolutely obsessed with every aspect of the trail.
So how did he get brought into the construction of the AT?
He was discovered by a guy named Judge Perkins. Arthur Perkins was a retired Connecticut judge that briefly took over the job of getting the AT built when it wasn't really moving anywhere in 1928. And he thought, you know, I'm retired. I'm not really the one to do this, but boy, this upstart kid will make it happen. And gee, he was right. He was a good talent evaluator. So yeah, he tapped Myron, and the rest is history. He really did it.
A fair bit of the book is the challenges he has to physically construct the thing. What was his vision about how it would get built, since it wasn't a federal project, at least until the CCC got involved in sections?
His vision was, if you build it, they will come, and he really wanted to have the trail complete, regardless of the precise placement of it. He just saw the need to get this thing built. What I think is really interesting and revealing about his personality is he knew that he was up against the Depression, and the money challenges were enormous, particularly when he got to the 288 miles that went through Maine. And so what he did is he went to the owners of the hunting and fishing camps and said, gee, there's great fishing early in the spring and there's great hunting in the fall, but you've got this bridge season with nobody here. What if hikers came through and spent the night and had meals with you and spent money? And every one of them said, that sounds great, sign me up. So that's how he got the trail built in Maine in incredibly short speed.
Yeah, you give some concrete examples of them running out of money for paint for the signs and so on. I mean, money was insanely tight.
Money was insanely tight, and it also gives us an appreciation for a bucket of paint was $2 or $3 back then, and they could not find the money. And he would beg and cajole and shame people into giving him what he needed, and he was unabashed about it. He would just keep pushing until he got what he needed, and you have to give him all the credit for pushing through and getting it done.
How did he map it out? I mean, how was the actual trail itself?
He went and did it. He found, he went himself, and he had a pretty good idea. He wasn't a cartographer, but he was really good with maps, and he saw where he thought the trail should go, and then he would grab a couple people and head out of DC and jump onto part of the Shenandoahs and, you know, wherever. I need to go from here to here, let's go on this mountain range. And they would literally blaze the path and cut it, and in many cases they'd put the paint blazes on right then and there so they'd remember where it was. And then they'd come back later and trim it out and start walking it and make it a real trail.
Now, by the 1930s, there wasn't a whole heck of a lot of public domain land east of the
Right.
Mississippi or even
Right.
federal land. So how did they acquire the rights to build a
Well,
trail right across New England, the Mid-Atlantic, and the Southeast?
yeah, that's what they actually just basically, they tried to use as much public land as
Yeah, it
possible.
goes through a lot of state parks.
And
and
there
so
were a
on.
lot of state parks
Yeah.
that they utilized. That was most of it. And then, as I said, when they had those bridge areas, they just figured it out. And in a lot of cases, particularly in New England, there were old logging roads that they were able to jump onto, and they figured it will establish the trail first. If we need to move it later, we will. But that's what they would do. So they'd get big sections accomplished that way. Even in state forests where logging and fire roads existed, they'd say, okay, we're going to hop on here and
That's
go
fast.
for a
'Cause I've
couple
always wondered
miles.
about that.
Yeah.
Was this all,
Yeah.
parkland?
It wasn't
part-
all bushwhacking by
Yeah.
any means, but they figured it out. And another really interesting character, I think, in the book is this guy named Walter Green, who was a Broadway actor. He
Yeah.
had 17 shows on Broadway that he was in, but he spent most of his his years on a lake in Maine. And Avery literally ran into him in the middle of nowhere, north of Katahdin, in the middle of the woods. They were both bushwhacking to go out and explore, and they literally had a Dr. Livingston moment in the middle of the woods. What are you doing here? And Avery told Green that he was building this great trail, and Green laughed and said, I know every inch of woods from Katahdin to Monson, which is now known as the 100-Mile Wilderness.
Yeah.
And Green basically told him where to put the trail. So they worked with foresters on some of it, but very famously, at age 64, Walter Green grabbed an axe and blazed the trail over the top of the barren Chairback mountain range in Maine by himself. And it's still an amazing feat when you hike over that and think, I'm starting to approach that and thinking, man, how did this guy just, and he had a funny way, he carried a pack with what they called a trump line, which was a headband that went down to the pack. And he would just carry these enormous loads of axes and saws and paint cans and everything else. And he'd write a letter back to Avery and say, okay, that trail's done now.
And there's a lot of personalities in the book that
Yes.
built this, since it wasn't just done as a large-scale federal project. But Avery has a particular personality that comes out. Tell us a little about his prickly personality.
Prickly is the word, or acerbic. He would not take no for an answer. His letters are so astounding to read that in many cases I put big chunks of them in there in the book because it really gives you an idea for how he thought. But he was not afraid of making enemies. He alienated one map publisher wrote to him at one point and said, you've done it now, you've alienated the entire publishing world. So he fought with editors. He really had this vision of how he thought things should be and would not suffer fools. He just wanted this thing built, and that's full steam ahead was his only speed. Blazing ahead indeed.
Yeah, it's a good title. So Pinchot and Muir had Hetch Hetchy Valley as their big controversy. It seems to me in your book, perhaps the culminating controversy is ironically in one of the more well-traveled parts of the AT and what's now Shenandoah National Park and Skyline Drive. Tell us about that controversy.
Skyline Drive was the wedge that drove Avery and Mackay apart, and it was quite stunning, actually. The Appalachian Trail community had what they thought was a reliable mole inside the workings of the Shenandoah Park Commission, and they were relying on him to feed back information that related to the trail coming from Shenandoah. What they didn't know is that everyone else on the commission knew that the guy was a mole, so they kept him out of the loop. And 29 miles of Skyline Drive were pretty much staked out and built before the rest of the AT community understood what was going on. So very famously, Mackay, Avery, and a fellow named Harold Anderson from Potomac Appalachian Trail Club went up to see what was going on, and they were stunned to see a road built over their trail. And they didn't know, they discussed what to do about it. Mackay was mortified because here was a guy who wanted the trail to be a place to get away from man-made things and to recreate and oxygenate, as he put it. And Avery's response was, well, we'll just get the Park Service to move the trail on. It's not that big a deal. And Mackay was, as I said, mortified. And that really started a falling out, a formal falling out between them that took a couple years to culminate. But by the end of it, Avery had commandeered control of Appalachian Trail Conservancy and the community and basically pushed Mackay and his followers out.
Did the Park Service really move the trail? Because it still
They
seems
did.
that, so they just put it
They moved
parallel to Skyline Drive?
Well, they sort of had to. One of the interesting parts about Shenandoah National Park is when they built the park, they originally had envisioned it being 3 times its size and predominantly wider. But in Virginia's efforts to reclaim the land, in other words, buy it from people who were already living there, they were falling short, and they kept falling shorter and shorter. So finally the government said, we can only accept this final smallest offer. But that's why, if you look at a map of it, it's very narrow.
Yeah.
And so when the road got built, there wasn't really, in a lot of places, there weren't really many options to move it aside very far. I think the furthest the trail gets from Skyline is 2 miles. So it's constantly in its shadow. But in order for the trail to stay in the park, that's what they had to do.
And yet it's become perhaps the most accessible part of the trail.
24 crossings and 108 miles. It's really, it's the juxtaposition to the 100-mile wilderness where in Maine, where there's 1 dirt road crossing in 100 miles. So you have both extremes on the same long-distance trail.
Why do you think Avery's largely forgotten and Mackay is still remembered, not as much as a Muir or Pinchot even, but?
Well, 2 things. I think Mackay is the originator of the idea, so that certainly helps. I think Myron's personality actually pushed people away, even historians. No one had
except
even,
you.
Yeah, no one had wanted to touch him in a biographical sense. And there was still a lot of controversy, and still to this day within the trail community, about his attitude and his personality. And conversely, I found it fascinating. I thought when I started, I was upset at some of the ways he was writing. I felt that he was not honoring the people at the other ends of the communications as much as he might. But what I came to realize is perhaps, and even more than perhaps, likely the trail would never have been completed unless it had that driving personality pushing it all the way to the end.
That segues to my final question about this book is, are there lessons to be learned from this tension between Mackay and Avery and the history behind the AT?
I think there are. I think that for me, I agree that the personality of Avery was needed to the extent that we needed someone who would persevere. I'm not sure we needed someone with that pointed an attitude. He did have friends, to be sure, but they were few. And Avery was more, or Mackay rather, was more of a well-known, had a lot of friends within government and private life as well, but didn't have the ability to project manage. So I think it really took both. And I think it's rare to find a single person with both aspects. So for me, the lesson for both of them is take the best of both, put them together, and you can get anything done.
I think that's a great way to go out, Jeff.
Yeah.
With a charge. This has been a real pleasure. And the 2 books, once again, are Appalachian Odyssey and Blazing Ahead. And Jeff, we look very much forward to your future projects and working with you again. Thank
Great.
you.
Thanks for having me. It's been wonderful.